Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. One of my viewers, Brother Cap, asked me to do a video discussing my process for creating characters, establishing their backstories, and establishing a plot for their stories. Now, when it comes down to the creation of characters, the creation of their backstories, and the creation of the plots for those stories, every writer has a completely different creative process. And all I can do is talk about my creative process. And when it comes down to my creative process, I usually use two unique approaches towards creating characters, their backstories, and a plot for their stories. And the first process that I pretty much use is a linear process. When it came down to the creation of the Isis character, I pretty much used a linear process, which was pretty much a straight line going forward. And the inspiration for the Isis character came from a dream I had about the goddess Isis and my interest in Egyptian mythology. And when I first had that dream about Isis, what I did was I decided to sketch up what the character looked like. And from that sketch, I began laying the foundation for my backstory as I did research on Egyptian and Nubian mythology. Now, this initial sketch was pretty crude, and it came up from a concept that I had for the Isis character with this black outfit, and I was going to make her this sort of superhero at the time. But then, as my research went on and I decided to go in a different direction, I came up with the white costume that Isis pretty much wears right now in Isis series books. And that whole process again came about from my research and doing research on it, and also looking at different pictures of different actresses. And when I saw a picture of Halle Berry when she had the long red hair, that pretty much gave me the inspiration for the visual look of Isis and what I wanted her to look like um, visually. And from that picture, I began working on the character's backstory. Now, the backstory for the Isis character was pretty much went like this. I wanted the character to be a descendant of the Egyptian gods or the Heliopolitan gods, and I came up with the whole daughter of Osiris concept. And I wanted the daughter of Osiris to come from Nubia. And the reason why I wanted her to come from Nubia, because Nubia was Egypt's sister nation, and that would make her Horus's sister, because Horus is supposed to be Osiris's son. So I wanted the daughter to come from Nubia. And she's the daughter of Osiris for another reason, and that was to make the character relatable to people, because I wanted her to be a half human, half goddess, because she was supposed to be an imperfect god. She was supposed to be flawed, socially awkward, and totally imperfect. She was supposed to be, this really skinny, awkward girl who pretty much doesn't look like the image of what anyone would think as a god would be. She's supposed to be a flawed god. She's supposed to be imperfect, and that was one of the things I wanted to put in the character so that readers could identify with the character, and relate to the character, and relate to the character's struggles. And that also fits into her backstory, because I wanted to pretty much make the character this imperfect person so that she could pretty much not be this ideal image of a god. And I wanted to talk about, women being imperfect with this Isis character. And as it relates to her plot, I wanted the character, as part of her backstory, to be a servant so she can learn how to serve the community and serve the people. And that's why the character started out as the daughter of a slave and a servant. And that also fits into her backstory. And that relates to her modern plots, because it relates to her mission of wanting to serve the community and wanting to help the black community. She sees herself, even though she was born in Nubia over 2,000 years ago, she still sees herself as a regular person and wants to help out regular, everyday people. So the backstory of the character of Isis was pretty much linear. It was a straight line, and in that process, I wanted to create a character who was, you know, connected to the Egyptian gods, connected to Egyptian and Nubian mythology, and could pretty much fit in the world of the African American community. And her stories were pretty much, I wanted them to pretty much have an easy backstory that could be easily accessed in any story, and you could follow it like a straight line from the first Isis, which was published in 2002, all the way up to from the first Isis, which was published in 2002, all the way up to the most recent Isis book, Samurai Goddess, which was published in 2017. And that was pretty much structured to be designed in a way that you could follow this character and her backstory in a simple and straightforward way, even though there's 2,000 years of continuity that pretty much readers have to read through. But it's because it's so easily structured, they can easily follow it. And when it comes down to plots, usually I get my inspiration from seeing different things and coming up with different ideas. Like for one story, Isis, My Sister, My Frenemy, I got the inspiration from that from a photo of me and my brother that we took many years ago, and I wanted to talk about how these two sisters, Isis and Eastine, were dealing with their relationship. Other stories like Isis the Beauty Myth, that was inspired by a book written by Naomi Wolf in the 1990s called The Beauty Myth. And for stories like Amari's Revenge, I had that idea for that story for many years, and I just never really developed it because I didn't really have the plot structures and things until I wrote The Thetas. And The Thetas was a book that pretty much inspired me to start the modern Isis series and laid the foundation for Isis being in the SJS Direct universe. And that's pretty much what I usually do with the Isis character and her character, her backstory, and her plots, because her plots pretty much are meant to be sort of comic booky and sort of supposed to be action and adventure. And that's what I usually do with that character. Now, when it comes down to other characters, I get my inspiration from different sources. Like, I remember when I was thinking of the Matilda Crowley character and laying out her foundation for her story, I pretty much laid that inspiration from listening to a Persia White interview that was posted on YouTube from Musgrove Entertainment. And as I was listening to that interview and I heard Persia White say that I'm so dark because I'm so light-skinned, I could pretty much relate to that as a light-skinned man. And that pretty much inspired me to start thinking about creating this African-American goth character, this Matilda Crowley, who was mixed race. Her and actress Tia Mowry pretty much inspired this Matilda Crowley character. And the first book that I wrote with this Matilda Crowley character was called Spinsterella, and the Spinsterella story was set into today. And after I published the Spinsterella book, I decided, after learning more about the goth subculture and learning about how people start their journey in the goth subculture, I decided to start working backwards in creating the backstory for the Matilda Crowley character. And that's what used to be done at many comic book companies as it related to superheroes. They would start out with the first appearance of the superhero, and then they would enter and create the origin story. And I used that process of going backwards with the Matilda Crowley character with the novel Spellbound. And with the Spellbound novel, I pretty much laid the backstory for the Matilda Crowley character's reasons for becoming a part of the goth subculture and why she wanted to become a goth in the goth subculture. And that was with that Matilda Crowley character's creative process. I pretty much started working in a backwards fashion with the Matilda Crowley character, and I took the character backwards, building up her history, building and creating that story set in the past. And I had to do a lot of research to pretty much establish that character's backstory. I just couldn't go on my personal memories of 1989. I wanted to do research on the year of 1989, the movies that came out, the songs that played on the radio, the clothes people wore, and I wanted to give people that clear picture of this character as she was in 1989, pretty much starting her journey into the goth subculture. So, with that story, I worked backwards. Moreover, as I was working on that story, I was pretty much working on the backstory from the structure of creating an entire novel, laying the foundation for that character's backstory. And this is a process I also used on another novel, The Thetas. And a lot of people don't know that The Thetas is actually set in the SJS Direct universe. And because The Thetas pretty much features a supporting character, Colleen, she is actually a supporting character in The Temptation of John Haynes. But I go into her backstory in this Thetas novel. And that's the beauty of backstory. You can pretty much use it as a part of continuity. You can go into the backstory of a supporting character, or you can go into the backstory of a main character. And if you write a really solid plot, it can stand as its own book and stand as its own story. Really good backstories, they can pretty much be their own story. And I've seen that done with stories like John Byrne's Superman, The Man of Steel, and Batman Year One. Those are stories, they are backstories into the character's backstory, but they stand alone as their own story. And you can do that with a character's backstory. It can either be its own story, or it can be referenced like it did with Amazing Fantasy 15 when they did the first appearance of Spider-Man, where they just did a little light backstory into Peter Parker, and then it led into the story of him becoming Spider-Man, or it can just be its own story. And writers, pretty much, we have that leeway to do that because the whole thing about backstories is that they are a fluid thing. And as you write and publish one story, it is becoming a part of a character's backstory. So when you're writing more recent stories, you can pretty much, use that material as reference material if you choose to do so. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're creating a continuity between those stories. And that's the beauty of working on stories, is that once you create the character and once you start creating stories, those old stories, as they are published, become part of the character's backstory. And you can use those plot points in that story or details in that story towards creating new stories. And that's what many smart writers like myself do. Will structure a story pretty much by creating that first story, like I did with Cinderella in 2015, and then use that for the backstory, like Spellbound and the most recent Legend of Mad Matilda, which I'm working on right now, which establishes Matilda as a 90s goth. Or we can just pretty much start in a straight line, like I did with Isis, where we set it right at one point in the character's history, and then go backwards and forwards, where the character tells us things about the past, and those things about the past can be used to create new stories, like I did with Amari's Revenge. Or we can just take a point in the character's history, like I did with the Thetas, and use that as a foundation to pretty much start the ISIS series. Because when it came down to the Thetas, there's one chapter in the story where the Doc Flowers character is talking to the Colleen character, and they mention this other character, the Andrea Thomas Robinson, and that's the point that I use to pretty much start the ISIS series with, because that pretty much establishes the ISIS character in the 20th century, and that's what leads to her adventures in the 21st century, and that was the foundation I pretty much use. When it comes down to characters and backstories and plots, you pretty much have you can use anything to inspire you. For certain characters, I have used actors to pretty much get my inspiration from. For example, the Eastteam character is inspired by actress Sally Richardson Whitfield. When I heard her voice in Disney's Gargoyles way back in the 90s, that's what inspired me to create the Eastteam character. And when I saw her picture on the cover of Ebony magazine, that's what really drew me to design the character to look close to her, because I always thought she had a great look for a bad guy, and I always thought she had a great look overall, and that was what inspired me for that character. Other characters, I drew inspiration from different things that I saw in creating their visual look. And it used to be that I used to design my characters first by drawing the character and then telling the story or writing a story around the character. But these days, I usually don't draw too much to design characters. I just create the character and pretty much leave them in my imagination. I usually don't draw them now. But back in the day, I used to draw them. That was part of my creative process for creating characters, and that pretty much helped me create the story for those characters. If you'd like to try some of the titles in the SJS Direct imprint, you can click the link in the description box that takes you to Amazon.com. All my titles are there, including the ISIS series, the Eastteam series, the Temptation of John Haynes, and the Thetas and the Spinsterella series. And if you really like this channel and you want to help me make more videos, you can donate to my Patreon or my PayPal by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.